I want us to focus in on the story of Abigail and Nabal, which is found in 1 Samuel 25. So if you will, open your Bibles to 1 Samuel 25, and we want to notice some characteristics of Abigail and Nabal here and see how we can apply these principles to studying about desperate marriages. And I would like to encourage you, if you would, to read this chapter, 1 Samuel 25, about once a week while we're doing these classes, because we're going to be continually referring back to this story, saying Abigail did this or Nabal did this. And so if you'll have this story in your mind very clearly, then you're going to get a lot more benefit from these lessons. Because Nabal and Abigail really is a classic to show us how to deal with these problems. This is the kind of man that Nabal was. Churlish, cruel, grievous, hard-hearted, a hard thing, heavy, obstinate, rough, sore, sorrowful, stiff-necked, stubborn. So this is the kind of man that Nabal was. And the evil means bad or evil, just naturally or morally, adversity, affliction, bad, calamity. So all of these words describe him. Not only that, but no one could speak to him. Even when his life depended upon him, he was such an obstinate and stiff-necked man that his servants, or neither his servants nor Abigail, could go and speak to him. Then his servants described him as a worthless man. And this is just the son of Baal, or the son of the devil. So it's a pretty strong term that they use for him. Worthless means without profit, worthless. By extension, destruction, wickedness. Baal, evil, naughty, ungodly man, or wicked. And then we find in verse 25 our word of folly, that folly is with him. Remember, this word folly means silly or stupid, with an idea of wickedness or perverseness with him. He wasn't able to think properly simply because of his attitude and his wickedness. And then Nabal was also a drunk. And so this is one man that we have in this story in 1 Samuel 25. Then what we want to do is we want to look at Abigail's characteristics. Abigail's characteristics are very different. These are characteristics that God gives us of her through inspiration. And these are characteristics that I think, because they are given to us before the story is written after the fact, that these are characteristics that she manifested throughout the story. First of all, I want to notice that she is intelligent. And intelligent is probably not a good English word here for us, because it means something different to us than what this word means. Out in the margin of the New American Standard, it says intelligent or of good understanding. Notice what the word intelligent or good understanding means. It means intelligence, by implication, success, a person that has success in the things that they think out and do, discretion, knowledge, policy, prudence, sense, understanding, wisdom, wise. So intelligent, a person can have book intelligence. They can have college degree type of intelligence, and they can still not have what Abigail had. Abigail had good sense and good understanding as far as knowing what life is all about and how to live her life and how to get along with other people. And so this is something that is very important. And we're going to be working on trying to be intelligent or of good understanding like Abigail was. She was also beautiful in appearance or countenance. Then she had discernment. Discernment, and of course this is something that David blessed her for, her discernment. The word discernment just simply means advice. She had good advice. Discernment properly means a taste, figuratively, perception, by implication, intelligence, a mandate, advice, behavior, decree, discretion, judgment, reason, taste, understanding. And we see this word taste up here several times, and we wonder, what in the world does taste have to do with all of these other words up here? I think it's a lot like a cook. You've got a cook cooking a dish, and she tastes it to see what it needs. What little flavors is it lacking? Does it need a little bit more salt, a little bit more garlic? She can taste for those fine flavors that make it good. So Abigail had this fine distinction, being able to look at things and to draw fine conclusions and to be able to give good advice, to have a good perception, to be able to think through things clearly. And so this is what we want to see if we can't develop the same characteristic in dealing with the same kind of problems that she was facing on a daily basis as she was dealing with Nabal. Okay, then we have the third character in our story is David. And we find that David was fighting the battles of the Lord, so God was using him. And he was also the anointed king of Israel. This is something that both Abigail and Nabal knew. Everyone knew that he was the anointed king. Then David also, even though he had these good characteristics, David was about to take vengeance into his own hands and to commit mass murder. But we're going to see that David was intellectually honest. And this intellectually honest quality of David is what I think separates David from Nabal. Here it is. Nabal was an evil man, and David was about to take vengeance. David was about to do something very bad by committing the murder. But by being intellectually honest, David had the ability to admit when he was wrong. When David committed adultery with Bathsheba, God sent a prophet to him and told him that he had done this horrible sin. David was able to admit it when a man convicted him of sin. And then when Abigail convicted him of about to do sin, David was able to listen even to a woman when she was telling him he was doing something was wrong, and he was able to admit even to a woman that he was wrong. And because David had this intellectual, honest quality about him, this is what separates problem marriages from desperate marriages. If a woman has a husband who's intellectually honest, and where when she gets his attention, she can show him that what you're doing is wrong, this isn't something you should be doing, then that man is going to respond, he's going to change, and that marriage is going to get good. In the desperate marriages, the man, even doesn't matter who's talking to him, he's unable to be intellectually honest. He denies his sin, he blames other people for his sin, and the sin does not get taken care of. So this one quality of David's, I feel like, is an extremely important characteristic for a man to have. And if a woman has a husband who is intellectually honest, then she needs to go home and hug that man's neck and tell him how wonderful it is to be married to a man who is intellectually honest, because they can solve any problem together that life is going to throw up at them. Okay, now what I want us to do is I want us to look at the story of Abigail and Nabal. And I want you to, when you go home, I want you to read all the verses and to be familiar with it, but we're just going to go over the basic verses and not take the time to read each verse. Basically, when you start the story, you find that David served Nabal. Nabal was I don't know if you'd call him a shepherd. He owned sheep, and he had shepherds who took care of them. And so Nabal was a very rich man who had lots and lots of sheep and lots of shepherds taking care of his sheep. And back at this time when David was hiding from Saul and living out in the hills, David came across Nabal's shepherds, and instead of stealing from Nabal and taking his sheep as food for his own men, David protected Nabal's shepherds from intruders and from all kinds of harm. And so David, of his own goodwill, served Nabal. Then what David did was David sent his men to ask Nabal for food. Now this is something that was very reasonable. It was the time of the shearing, and at the shearing time it was the custom of the men who owned the flocks to throw a great big banquet, to fix a great big amount of food to say thank you to all of their neighbors and all of the shepherds and everybody who had worked for them and served them. This was their custom, to fix this banquet and to serve the food. It's kind of like what we have in our days. Many times when employers give Christmas bonuses. They either give money or they give a ham or a turkey or something like this to say thank you. Well, this was their custom. And since David had been out serving Nabal, he sent his men to ask for food from Nabal. This was a logical request. He didn't go, but he sent his men to Nabal, and he says, Nabal, here's what my men have done for you. Just ask your own servants. They will tell you. David says, don't take my word for it. Your men will tell you. So instead of Nabal asking his men and checking out David's story, instead Nabal rebuked David's servants, and he says, who's David? There's all kinds of young upstarts going around here claiming to be the king and this sort of thing. And who's David? So he made fun of David and sent his men back. When David's men got back to where he was and they told David about how Nabal had rebuked him, it made David so angry that he not only wanted to kill Nabal, but he wanted to kill every single male in his household. So this means to kill every one of his servants. David wanted to commit mass murder, or a massacre, really, was what he wanted to do. He was so angry. Then we find that when the servants came to Abigail, they said, Abigail, here's what has happened. Nobody can talk to Nabal. He won't listen. And if you don't do something, then surely there is harm plotted against our master. So Abigail accepted her responsibility. She was a hostess. She had some responsibility in providing food, and so she accepted not Nabal's responsibility, but she accepted her own responsibility. Then she loaded donkeys with food, and the Bible tells us about all the food she took. And you might think, well, where in the world did she get all of that food? But this was a feast. It was already prepared, so all she had to do was simply load food that was already prepared and take it to David. Then we want to notice her conversation with David. When she got to David, she accepted blame for what she had done. She did not accept blame for what Nabal had done. She accepted blame for what she did. And let's read this so that we can have this clear in our minds. In 1 Samuel 25, verse 24, this is in her conversation to David. It says, "And she fell at his feet and said, 'On me alone, my Lord, be the blame. And please let your maidservant speak to you, and listen to the words of your maidservant.'" Then in verse 25, "Please do not let my Lord pay attention to this worthless man, Nabal. For as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and Folly is with him. But I, your maidservant, did not see the young men of my Lord whom you sent. Now therefore, my Lord, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, since the Lord has restrained you from shedding blood and from avenging yourself by your own hand, now let your enemies and those who seek evil against my Lord be as Nabal." Now notice she has not apologized for what Nabal did. She has said in verse 25 that he's a worthless man. Nabal is his name. Nabal is the Hebrew for fool, a worthless, evil man. And she says that so is his name, and Folly is with him. This is that word we saw earlier where he's a perverse, evil man. But she says, "I, your maidservant, did not see the young men of my Lord whom you sent." She's saying, I was a hostess. I had some responsibility. I didn't see your men, and if I had seen your men, I would have loaded them down with food, and I would have sent food with them. So she accepted blame for what she did, not what Nabal did. And this is something that a person with a healthy self-image can do. They are able to accept blame for what they do wrong while rejecting what the other person has done wrong, while recognizing what the other person has done wrong. She told David, "David, you don't sin because of a jerk. Nabal is a jerk. He's a worthless man. Folly is with him, and you don't sin because of him." Now, if she told David, "You don't sin because of a jerk," what do you think her attitude was toward herself? She wasn't going to sin because of a jerk. And I think that is something that we need to burn in our minds, especially in dealing with women in desperate marriages. Whatever you do, don't sin because of a jerk. You have your devotion made to God, and you be determined that you're going to do what's right, but you don't let a jerk manipulate you and affect your thinking in such a way so that you sin. So she told David, she just told it like it was. She didn't cover up for Nabal. She did not make excuses for him. She didn't say he's had too much to drink. She didn't say he had a hard day. She didn't say that he had a bad childhood. She didn't say any of those things that women say. She just said, this is what he is. He is a worthless person, and Nabal is his name, that is the way he is. Then she saw the good in David, that he was the anointed king. Someday he was going to reign over Israel, and that this was beneath him to commit this mass murder, that this was not within characteristic of him to do this. Then she appealed to his authority as the anointed king. Of course, this is something in these desperate situations. We're going to talk about this in a later class. These men many times have real strong determinations. I'm going to be the leader. I'm the boss. And they misuse their authority. And once we understand the proper relationship of subjection and leadership, then we're going to be able to appeal to their authority in the right way, their right authority. So this is something that is important. It's something that she did. Then she reminded David of the consequences. If you do this evil thing, then someday when you're sitting on the throne of Israel, then you're going to be ashamed of committing this mass murder, and you're going to suffer because of it. So she reminded him of the consequences. Then she asked David essentially for his forgiveness, let his anger be on her, and David forgave her. He blessed her for coming to him and helping him see that what he was doing was a harmful thing. Then he called her a blessing from God, and that God, in his view, had sent her. Now, I don't think that God performed some kind of a miracle and sent Abigail like he sent the prophet many times, and like God sent the prophet to tell David when he had committed murder and adultery with Bathsheba. But simply in Proverbs 19, verse 14, where it talks about that a prudent wife is from the Lord, this word prudent is the same word as good understanding that Abigail had. Abigail had the good understanding, and when you have a prudent wife, a woman with good understanding like Abigail had, she is from the Lord. This is something that God gives men. So simply what I think she was doing is she was using her God-given talents and her God-given intelligence to persuade David not to do this. Okay, Abigail took care of the problem with she took care of the problem with David. Now she's got the problem with Nabal to take care of. When Abigail goes back, let's turn over to 1 Samuel 25, verse 36. Here it says, Then Abigail came to Nabal, and behold, he was holding a feast in his house, like the feast of a king. And Nabal's heart was merry within him, for he was very drunk. So she did not tell him anything at all until the morning light. Verse 37, But it came about in the morning when the wine had gone out of Nabal, that his wife told him these things, and his heart died within him, so that he became as a stone. First of all, I want us to see that Abigail was a submissive wife. You remember last week when we studied about subjection, that subjection is in the realm of opinion, and that God's laws override the husband's opinion. Abigail had certain responsibilities toward David, not only because her husband owed him what we might say she owed him money or owed him food because of the work that he'd done, but also because David was the anointed king. She knew that. She had a certain responsibility to him, just like we're to be in subjection to the government. She had a certain responsibility towards David that Nabal could not take away from her. So when she went out and did the opposite of what Nabal did, she was obeying God rather than man, and she was a submissive wife. She was understanding that true subjection is to God first. God's law overrode Nabal, so she was submissive. We see her submissiveness in the fact that she didn't do this behind Nabal's back. She was going to tell him. She wanted him to know exactly what was going on. But she had the wisdom and the good sense to pick the right time. Nabal, when she got home, he was having a party. It says he was having a party like a king. And so he was in no shape mentally to listen to what she had to say to him. So she picked the time when he was mentally clear thinking, when he had sobered up so he could understand what was going on. And then it says he became a stone. We think about he became a stone when she told him what had happened. I want us to think a little bit about Nabal. It says that Nabal was partying like a king. And can you just imagine, kind of place yourself back there and think about how he was partying? I can just, real easily, I can picture Nabal telling his friends about, boy, I really showed David. He sent his men up here to try to get food off of me. And, well, who's David? Who's he? And just making fun of David. And probably told his men, boy, I'd like to be a little mouse back in that camp and see David's reaction when his men told him that. Nabal was proud of what he did. He was loaded with liquor, with alcohol, and he was having a real party, a real feast. And here's something that he was real proud of. She comes along and she says, Nabal, do you know that you were nearly killed? And not only were you nearly killed, every male servant we've got was nearly killed. David was so angry he just nearly wiped us off of the face of the earth. Nabal was no longer drunk. Nabal was sober. Nabal came face to face with the horribleness of what he had done. Now Abigail, she didn't nag. She didn't browbeat him. She didn't ridicule him. All she did was she told him, here's the fact of what happened. And Nabal's reaction was that he became a stone. Now I used to think that this meant that he must have had some kind of an attack of some sort, some kind of I can't think of the word I'm looking for, stroke, and became a stone. But I no longer think that's what happened. In let me see his name here. In J. Adams' book, Competent to Counsel, he talks about working in psychiatric hospitals where there are people in the psychiatric hospitals who are in stupors. He's saying you can put your hand in front of their face and they don't blink, they don't see anything, they don't act like they hear you, you can stick a pin in them and they don't react, they're just in a total stupor. And he said he was involved in an experiment where they went up to these people who were in stupors and they told these people that we know you've committed some kind of a horrible sin. We know about the sins you've committed. And you just confess your sins. If you'll confess your sins, that you'll come out of the stupor. And every day they go up to these people and they talk to them. We know you've done something horrible. You just confess what you've done. And they would do this for several days, and when the people would finally confess whatever horrible sin it is that they've done, they would come out of the stupor and they would be like a normal person. One reaction to unrepentant sin, horrible sin, is a stupor. And I think this is what has happened to Nabal. This word stone means a stone is a masonry stone. It's a stone sets up. This is what has happened. So he kind of sets up and becomes as a stone. Nabal came face to face with the real Nabal, with the horribleness of what he had done, and then instead of repenting, because he was this obstinate fool, because he was the kind of man he was who could not admit that he was wrong like David could, then he became as a stone. And then after 10 days, God struck him and he died. And I think during these 10 days that Nabal had the opportunity to repent. God gave him 10 days to repent and make this right. And because of his stubbornness, that he didn't. Then after David learned that Nabal had died, David sent for Abigail and he married her and she became one of his wives. So here it is. We find a man who marrying the woman who came and rebuked him and who, I don't want to use the word criticized him, but she did point out the sin that he was about to be involved in. And because of the way that she did it, then he married her and he was able to appreciate her. And there really is a happy ending to the story in that way. Okay, as we finish the story of Abigail and Nabal, this next section that I'm going to present to you on dealing with desperate marriages. Now, as I told you earlier Sunday, I went to the women's shelter so I could sit in on one of their support groups because I thought it would stimulate my mind and it would give me ideas. And sure enough, it did. As I came home and as I was thinking about listening to those women for 2 hours and thinking about other Christian women that I've talked to in desperate marriages, I realized that the problem that they have in dealing with their desperate marriage, that there's a common problem of why that marriage grows desperate over the years. There's a common source of problems, and that's what I want to talk to you about right now. Now, this material that I'm going to present is in your book. It's in Volume 1. It's in Chapter 4. So you do have this information. I'm going to have you read that next week, not this week, so you do have it. But I have not made the applications in that chapter that I'm going to be making in our class tonight because I haven't seen the relationship. And that is, in thinking about these women and listening to them talk, these women, where their marriage starts to enter a desperate relationship, is that they do not have the first quality of true wisdom. So I want us to talk about true wisdom and apply this to desperate marriages, because not only do these women in desperate marriages not have the first characteristic of true wisdom, oftentimes the people who are counseling them, who are working with them, do not have the first characteristic of true wisdom either. And because they don't have this first characteristic of true wisdom, what happens afterwards is wrong. And because Abigail had true wisdom, because she had discretion, this is an extremely important characteristic. So I want us to spend some time talking about wisdom and applying it to this problem. First of all, the purpose of wisdom, and if you will, let's just turn in our Bibles over to Proverbs chapter 1, verses 1 through 2. We're going to spend all of our time right there in Proverbs learning about wisdom. And of course, the book of Proverbs is written by Solomon, and it is about wisdom, to help us get wisdom. So in the very beginning of Proverbs, it is talking about getting wisdom and basic characteristics of wisdom. So in Proverbs chapter 1, verses 1 through 2, it says, "The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to discern the sayings of understanding, to receive instruction in wise behavior, righteousness, justice, and equity," and so on it goes. So that's what we want to do, is we want to make some discernments about wisdom. And notice the purpose of wisdom. The word wisdom simply means to be wise in mind, word, or act. And that's what we want to do as we're looking at desperate marriages. We want to be wise in mind, word, and action. So this is something that we're wanting to develop. The first characteristic necessary in order to have wisdom is the ability to recognize problems. Wisdom recognizes problems. We see this in verse 2 where it says to know wisdom and instruction. This word instruction means properly chastisement, figuratively reproof, warning, or instruction, also restraint, correction, discipline, doctrine, instruction, and rebuke. So basically, if we know wisdom and instruction, we have the ability to chastise ourselves, we have the ability to reprove ourselves, we have the ability to warn ourselves, we have the ability to restrain ourselves, we have the ability to correct ourselves, we have self-discipline, we have an idea or we know what true doctrine is, instruction and rebuke. So we're able to recognize problems in our life. And we say, well sure, everybody knows when they have a problem. And to a certain degree, that's right. Everybody knows when they have a problem, but they don't recognize what the problem is. For example, when we apply this to abusive relationships, we find that these women might say, well, my problem is my husband physically abuses me, or my husband verbally abuses me. They can see the great big overall problem, but they are not able to recognize the little problems. They all are seeing is this great big overriding problem, but they're not able to see the little problems. They're not able to see what part of this is his problem and what part of it is her problem. And many times the women blame themselves for things that are not their problem, things that they should be saying, that's his problem, that's his responsibility, that's something he needs to straighten up. They don't have the ability to do that, to make these fine distinctions and to see what the problem really is. They have a very shallow understanding of the problem. And because those of us many times who are counseling with them have a shallow understanding of the problem, then we give them bad advice. We don't properly support them. A couple illustrations that I might give you to illustrate this is when we lived in California, we had a next-door neighbor that was really a good neighbor. She had a couple of little girls that my son liked to play with, and she's always interested in him. He'd come home from school, and he'd show me his schoolwork, and then he'd run next door, and he'd show it to her. Because she had this warm personality, and she and I, we visited a lot, and we did things together a lot. And she was just really a neat neighbor. One day, my son had been playing outside, and he came home, and his eyes were just as big as they could be, and he says, Mother, he says, I just heard our neighbor slap the lady next door. And he was upset about it, and he's wanting to know what to think about it. And I said, well, what happened? Tell me what happened. He says, well, I was playing in the front yard, and they were in the house, and I could hear him slap her outside. And he said in a little bit she came out, and he said, I asked her, she is okay? And she says, yes, she is okay. And then she went for a walk. And so he was asking me, what about this? And so we had an opportunity to talk about this. This isn't the proper way to act, and you did the right thing to come home and to tell me and for us to be able to talk about it. Well, this is around Christmas time, and I thought, well, what I need to do is I need to talk to her about this situation. But since it was around Christmas time, it seemed like every time I'd look out the kitchen window, there's cars over in her driveway. She's got relatives or company, just company all the time over at her house. It took about 6 weeks for me to get an opportunity to talk to her about this problem, and she came over and sat down and visited with me. So I just told her what I told you. I said, the other day, Wesley came home and told me that he heard your husband slap you. And I said, I want you to know what my reaction was to that. I said, when Wesley told me that, I said, that made me so angry. I said, because you are too nice a person to end up as a battered wife. And so her reaction was typical of battered women. She says, well, it was really my fault. And so I told her, I said, do you know that is what every battered woman says? It's her fault. I said, it's not your fault. I said, he's the leader, and it doesn't matter what you did. As the leader, as the head of the family, it is his responsibility to do what is right, and it doesn't matter what you did. And as long as you're blaming yourself and he is blaming you, you're not going to solve this problem. And I also told her, I said, you have got to take care of this problem right now while it is little, because if you don't, it's going to get worse, and you're going to end up being a full-fledged battered wife. And so we talked about it for a while, and she told me that they were getting some counseling. And she told me that she appreciated me talking to her and to not be talking to her in a real judgmental way. And she was very open with me and talked to me about some other problems. But her reaction to this was typical. It was my fault. So these women, what I'm saying is, they don't have the ability to recognize the problem. It's not her fault. He's got a problem with his temper, and it really doesn't matter in these situations what the wife is doing. These men are going to express their anger and their frustrations in a physical or a verbal way, regardless of what the wife does. So they need to be able to recognize what the problem really is. And because of our naiveness and their naiveness about wife abuse and verbal abuse, many times we don't recognize the problem. We're unable to put things in little categories and say, yes, this is my problem in this area, and this is his problem in this other area. Another example of this is a lady told me that was talking to me about how hard it was to please her husband. And she gave me an example of how hard it was to please her husband. So she gets up very early in the morning and does things while she waits for her husband to get up. And when her husband got up, she was going to fix breakfast, and she started making pancakes. When her husband saw that she was making pancakes, he began to criticize her. Why are you making pancakes? You know I like waffles better than pancakes. And she says, yes, she knew that, but pancakes are a lot easier to make than waffles, and she fixes pancakes more frequently than she fixes waffles, and she thought he would like that. Well, once he began to criticize her, she thought, well, obviously he doesn't want pancakes. So she fixed him bacon and eggs. And she says, now normally, she says he loves bacon and eggs, and she doesn't fix bacon and eggs very often because of his cholesterol. So bacon and eggs is a treat. So it looks to her like he doesn't want pancakes, so bacon and eggs will be a treat. They sat down to breakfast. She had fixed 2 pancakes for herself because that was what she wanted, and he sat down to a plate of bacon and eggs, which she thought he would like. And she said, he began to browbeat her again. Why do we have 2 breakfasts? Why am I having bacon and eggs and you're having waffles? Well, she thought, try to fix waffles for him, or not waffles, but pancakes for him, and she didn't think he wanted. She says, I can't please the man. Whatever I try to do, I can't please the man. Well, she was taking upon herself, viewing this as a problem of her problem. I can't please the man. I can't do anything to please him. I told her, it's not your problem. God has given the man the responsibility for his own happiness and to not be embittered against his wife in Colossians, where he talks about the man to love his wife and to not be embittered against her. He has a responsibility for being happy. He has a responsibility for wanting to be pleased. And so something when we talk about problems with unreasonable perfectionism, we're going to see that there are some men that don't want to be pleased. And so I said, this isn't your problem. You tried to please him. In a normal marriage, a man recognizes that and he's pleased. I said, and she says, well, what would you do in a situation like this? I said, well, what I would do is I would tell him, I'm sorry that you chose not to be pleased. I tried to please you, but I'm sorry that your choice was not to be pleased, recognizing it is his problem. The problem wasn't whether she fixed pancakes or whether she fixed eggs and bacon. The problem was the man simply did not want to be pleased, and he chose not to be pleased. So many times in these problems of desperate marriages, there is a problem right up here in the beginning of not recognizing what is the man's problem and what is the woman's problem. When there is sin involved, sin leads to all kinds of problems. We're having a problem because of the sin that's in our marriage, something of this nature. So recognizing problems is not easy in desperate marriages. It's something that requires a lot of skill. It's something we're going to be spending a lot of work on. That's why we're going to be looking at the profile of a sinner, so that we can develop the skill to recognize what goes along with sin, so that we cannot assume problems upon ourselves or assume them on other women simply because we don't know how to recognize the problem and whose problem it really is. Now, the second quality of true wisdom is, after someone has realized they have a problem, is to find a solution. And in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 2 that we just read, where it says to discern the sayings of understanding. Discern and understanding mean to separate mentally or distinguish, i.e. generally to understand. If we're able to discern the sayings of understanding, and these words are real closely, as you can see, related, then we're able to mentally separate things, to put things in categories, to see fine distinctions between things. And so this is what Abigail did. She had the ability to understand that about subjection, that she was obeying God instead of man. That obeying God is what comes first. This is separating things mentally and understanding them. Now, if we're going to be a wise person, we're going to have to find solutions for these problems of life. Part of finding solutions is just proposing solutions. You know, we can propose a whole list of solutions. A woman can say, well, I can divorce him. I can throw my pancakes in his face. Or I can walk out and leave him. Or I can, this one wife told me, she says, I know divorce is wrong, but what about murder? So that's a solution sometimes people think about. We can come up with all kinds of solutions. But if we're wise, then we're going to be able to look at our solution and say, will it work? Will it make the problem better, or will it make the problem worse? And so what we're going to need here in finding solutions is we're going to have a good understanding of God's will. Because if we're doing what God said, then we have a guarantee that it's going to work. God understands us. He understands how our husbands think. And even if we don't see the wisdom behind it, if we're obeying God, then we're going to have success. Now, the success may not be the saving of our marriage, because God doesn't guarantee that. In 1 Corinthians 7, he says, how do you know, O wife, if you will save your husband? What we may save is our own soul or our own sanity, where we can help women where they're not fighting for emotional survival and fighting for spiritual survival. So we need to be able to propose a solution. And as I was listening to these women in the shelter Sunday, and they were talking about what they were doing and what they had done, finding solutions is something that wasn't easy for them. This is something that was very hard for them to know what to do. They're intimidated by their husband's anger. They're intimidated by their husband's violence, and they're not able to think clearly and rationally. So this is something, if we're going to be like Abigail, then it's something that we're going to have to work on, but it is something that is difficult in this particular area. And then, as we are proposing solutions, then what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to come along and solve those problems. We're going to have to verify that our solutions are going to work, and then have the courage to implement them into our lives and to do what God would have us to do. And again, as I was listening to these women, I was hearing that it was taking all kinds of courage for them to do what they knew they had to do, not only to, in fact, they weren't trying to save their marriages. They were trying to save their lives. They were trying to save themselves as an emotional person. So what it took for them to solve their problems, it took them a tremendous amount of courage. Women in desperate marriages, then they are going to require a tremendous amount of courage also to deal with their problems, because we are dealing with severe problems. And anytime you're dealing with sin, many times we're going to see in our profile of the sinner that the sinner puts a tremendous amount of pressure on his spouse in order to continue in that sin. So these people need a lot of help in applying the solutions to their marriages and to really solving their problems. Notice in Proverbs 1:3, talking about wisdom, is to receive instruction in wise behavior. So that's what we're talking about, having wise behavior with righteousness, justice, and equity. And so wise behavior means to be or cause or make or act circumspect and hence intelligent. So that's what we want to be. We want to be like Abigail. We want to be acting wise and to have wise behavior. Wise behavior involves righteousness, justice, and equity. Righteousness involves doing what is right regardless of what the other does or does not do. So this is something that is important. Many times if a woman has an attitude, make him straighten up, and then I will, she doesn't have righteous behavior. Righteous behavior does what is right regardless of what the other person does. This is something in dealing with these desperate marriages where these husbands are involved in sin. The women are going to have to go ahead and do what is right regardless of what their husband does. And this is something that involves a lot of character, and it involves a lot of courage. And it is something that is going to give them peace in the end. It's going to make their lives, maybe not save their marriage, but it's going to make their lives better. Then justice is involved. Justice describes the ability to make wise decisions in regard to the affairs of the other. And if we're going to be practicing vengeance or justice, then we're not going to be taking vengeance. We're going to be leaving vengeance up to God and allow God to take the vengeance. It's not our job to punish our husband for the thing that he's done that's made our life miserable. That is God's job, and we're going to leave it up to God. Then equity refers to the ability to treat others equally and fairly without prejudice. As I listen to these women in desperate marriages talk, in fact, as when I go to the shelter, these women would say things, and all the other women who are listening, they'd be shaking their heads, yes, like that's the way men act. For example, this one woman that was talking, she's telling about how her husband, she had lived with him for 2 years before she married him, and now they had been married for 1 year, and she's divorcing him because he started hitting on her. And she told me that in his first marriage, she talked to his first wife, and that his first wife told her that he gets violent. But she had never seen that, so she tended to not believe it. And because the man she was living with told her his first wife was crazy. When we look at the characteristics of wife abusers, it's also a characteristic of alcoholics, is that they say their wife is crazy. This is a very common characteristic and gripe of these men. She's crazy. And so this kind of time you hear this, you think, yeah, that's typical. That's this way they talk. But anyway, she believed him. He said his wife was crazy, so she believed him. And when she says he gets violent, she didn't pay any attention to that because she hadn't saw that. But she was seeing his emotional abuse. She said his emotional abuse for 2 years was really bad. Now, why in the world she married him, I don't know. She should have recognized that emotional abuse often leads to physical abuse. She should have been concerned. But she went ahead and married him for a year, then he started getting physical with her. Okay, they have since separated, and she thinks he has another girlfriend on the side. And she says, I'm trying to find out about it for sure so that the church where I go can have that evidence and things will be okay with them because I'm divorcing him, was what she said. But the point that I'm wanting to make is what she's telling all these other women is she says that I went over to the house and she says he's not paying any bills and he's not working right, and she says he borrowed $20 from me. So she loaned him $20. And she says, you know what I found out later? He borrowed $20 off of me so he could spend it on his girlfriend. So he could take his girlfriend out. And all the women in the room were shaking their heads. Yeah, I mean, this sounds just exactly like one of these guys. They borrow money off of you so they can take their girlfriend out. And so they've got this attitude towards men. Men are this way. Well, equity means that we're going to treat others equally. We're not going to label all men as this type, that men use their wives in these ways. Christian women that I've heard talk about men who live in desperate situations, abusive situations, they have very low negative attitudes many times towards men in general. All men aren't this way. We need to recognize that they're not. And we need to treat them equally and fairly without prejudice. We're dealing with their sins and not labeling all men. Many times women are put in categories of prejudice, this sort of thing. So we need to be sure that when we're finding wisdom, that we're practicing righteousness and justice and equity. I think one of the reasons why women in desperate marriages get so depressed is because we have innate basic attitudes of justice and equity. We believe in justice and equity. And when we can see that our husband is not treating us in a just way, when women can see that, and they're covering it up and they're passing over it and trying to ignore it, then it causes depression because they're not dealing with the sin. So this is something that is important for us to make sure we have these three characteristics. Then, as we continue looking at wisdom, we want to see that everybody needs wisdom. In Proverbs 1, verse 7, where we still are, it says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning. Let me start up in verse 4. That wisdom is to give prudence to the naive and to the youth knowledge and discretion. So here it is, the naive. This is not our word fool. Word naive simply means roomy. He doesn't have any knowledge. He doesn't have the bad attitudes that the fool has. So wisdom gives prudence to the naive, and to the youth knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and increase in learning, and a man of understanding will acquire wise counsel. So wise people learn from wisdom and get even wiser. Then in verse 6, to understand a proverb and a figure and the words of the wise and their riddles, which is what Proverbs is all about. Verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. So the beginning of knowledge is fear God. What's God's laws? What's God's rules in this subject that we're talking about? So this is where we're going to be going to get wisdom. Here's our word for fool, someone who is stupid, someone who is sinful or perverse. Then they despise wisdom and instruction, so they're not going to be looking at it. Then in Proverbs 4, verses 18 through 19, is we need to give these women who are involved in desperate marriages time to grow, and they need to give themselves time to grow. In Proverbs 4, verses 18 through 19, here it is, it says, "But the path of the righteous is like the light of dawn, that shines brighter and brighter until the full day. And the way of the wicked is like darkness. They do not know over what they stumble." So here it is, if a person is trying to act right, they're trying to learn God's will, do what God says, he says their path is like the light of dawn. The sun comes up and you can see a little bit, but you can't see everything clearly. But yet as the sun comes up more and more, then you can see everything more and more clearly. So as we start to study these things, there may be some things that aren't clear to us, but we're going to grow. We're going to have more and more light shed upon this subject, and we're going to be gaining in wisdom so that we can help these women and help them help themselves. So we need to give them time to grow. And then we need to look for answers in small places. There's not going to be one great big answer that we can just plug in that's going to solve everything. The solution to the problem of desperate marriages is going to be the combination of a lot of little things. I'm going to stop right there.